All right, U.S. history, here we are, the last day before Thanksgiving break. And of course, you'll have a little mission over Thanksgiving break, which we talked about on Monday. You were supposed to begin your story map on Monday. Mr. Henschel said that the Cami website did not work. And it just so happens that I put all that work in to create that. And that one day, the entire website goes down. Luckily, Mr. Henschel was there and had the story map sheets that you could fill out in school. So what we're going to do today is we're going to go over the story. Why not? I'll kind of give you guys a little what's up on it. Again, our objective, tell the story of the Spanish-American War to a family member over Thanksgiving break. That's what you're trying to do. This week, you should have maybe 1 through 7, 1 through 8 done. We learned the story through the digital map, and over break, you're going to record yourself telling the story to a family member. That's what we're trying to do. That's the overall thing. It's going to be a little summative grade with your recording. Okay, I'm not going to take a grade on the story map. That is supposed to just help you do a good job on the recording. Okay, essential question. Let's go back to it. We always want to go back to it. What factors led Americans to acquire colonies and spread American power overseas? And as you are going to find out, or you already have, the Spanish-American War is a big thing. So why did the U.S. go to war against Spain in 1898? And why was the outcome significant? Well, it was significant because it's one of the factors, right? And let's remember that date, 1898, because this is one of the shortest American wars. It only takes 10 weeks. So this is just an important date because you don't have to remember 2 dates. You just have to remember one. Okay, so 1898, very important year in American history. Now I'm going to go down the story map, and I'm going to start with the introduction, which is not really on your story map, but I certainly want to make sure that we understand this term, yellow journalism, which is sensational news stories. And obviously, yellow journalism in today's age is a big thing, right? So one of the favorite subjects of this yellow journalism during this time was the brutal suppression and the rebellion in Cuba against Spanish rule. And this inflamed public support in going to war against Spain. So that was the introduction of the chapter. Just kind of wanted to make sure we understand that term of yellow journalism. Sensationalized news stories, right? And we see it today all the time. AOC, she's a socialist. Oh my God, right? This is what we see, right? So let's be aware that yellow journalism is a term that, I feel like this is a really good chapter for what's going on today because I think there's a lot of connections. So number 1 should be in there. Cuban struggle for independence, right? In 1868, this is right after the Civil War here, a revolutionary group largely made up of poor whites, free blacks, and slaves demanded independence from Spain and established a republic and the end of slavery. Spain rejected these demands and bitter fighting followed, and they put down the rebellion. They crushed the revolt, but trying to ease the tensions, right, by agreeing to limited reforms, by giving Cubans representation in the government and abolishing slavery in 1886. So the revolution had a couple of positive things going on, right? Second one, I think, is Jose Marti is probably who you should have in your story map, okay? In 1895, the Cubans rebelled again, and this was led by Jose Marti, a Cuban poet, journalist, and statesman. Right? He was forced to leave Cuba due to the revolutionary activities and lived in the U.S. from 1881 to 1895. I believe he lived in New York City, and he did a lot of writing and kind of led this ideological revolt from there until he sailed back to Cuba in 1895 to lead and was killed in combat soon thereafter. So he was a martyr for the Cuban cause. Jose Marti, that is number 2 in your story map. Number 3, General Valeriano Weyler, also known as the Butcher, as yellow journalism would put him. In 1896, Spain sent a new commander to put down the uprising. This gentleman forced tens of thousands of Cubans to reconcentration camps which were overcrowded, unsanitary prison camps that led to thousands of deaths from disease and starvation. Not a nice guy. Americans really sympathize with these people because they see it as a struggle for freedom, like the American Revolution, right? Like representation without taxation without representation, right? Things like this. These poor people are being persecuted by their colonial leaders, right? And William McKinley is elected in 1896. He hopes to stay neutral. William McKinley was a Civil War veteran who knew that war was horrible and did not want anything to do with it. So he wanted to continue to go with the Washington farewell address that we talked about last week about foreign policy being neutral. Mass media, very important factor in starting this war. This is William Randolph Hearst there on the top and Joseph Pulitzer on the bottom, right? They are competing newspaper guys, right? It's like Fox News and CNN, right? And the way you sell newspapers is to get interesting things to read. And the reporters and artists were encouraged to stretch the truth about the bravery of the Cuban rebels and the horrors of Spanish rule, especially Weyler's, the butcher's, brutality. So this mass media of newspapers and magazines completely gets everybody riled up about what's going on there in Cuba. The Delhomme letter, written by Enrique de Puy Delhomme, the Spanish ambassador to Washington. It was addressed to a friend in Cuba, but somehow was stolen from the mail. And in this, he calls McKinley a weak and catering to the rabble, and besides, a low politician. So again, they take this, it's printed in the paper, Americans are even more offended, and it intensifies the anti-Spanish feelings in the U.S. when their ambassador is calling our leader weak, right? Sinking in the Maine, right? This is one of the three violent acts that totally changes foreign policy in our country. Sinking of the Maine sailed to Cuba in January of 1898 after riots broke out in the streets of Havana. He sent the Maine there to protect American interest. Again, Americans own a little land in Cuba. We're like running plantations of sugar farms and things like this. It sat in the harbor for 2 weeks until the night of February 15th when a tremendous explosion rocked the battleship and sunk the battleship on February 15th. More than 260 sailors died immediately. These papers blame Spain. Remember the Maine became a rallying cry for war. So again, the sinking of the Maine was this violent act that totally freaks everybody out. And now we're going to come after you, Spain, right? Redfield Proctor, he was a senator from Vermont, right? He visited Cuba and described the horrible conditions there. He went to the reconcentration camps. To me, the strongest appeal is not to the barbarity practiced by Weyler, nor the loss of the Maine, but the spectacle of 1.5 million people, the entire population of Cuba, struggling for freedom and deliverance from the worst misgovernment of which I ever had knowledge, right? So he's trying to say it's our duty as Americans to protect these people for what our beliefs are, which is, of course, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, right? Congress declares war. So under pressure, William McKinley, of course, who was a Civil War veteran, he asked Congress to declare war on Spain. Congress passes a resolution, a formal statement about the course of action, recognizing Cuban independence and authorizing military force to liberate Cuba, right? So the Congress passes a resolution saying, we're going to recognize Cuban independence and authorize military force to liberate Cuba if we have to, right? And this is where we see the Teller Amendment. After Cuba was liberated and peace restored, the U.S. would, and we're going to come back to this, leave the government in control of the island to its people, right? That's what they're trying to do. Spain declares war on April 25th, and Congress formally declares war on Spain. So now we're at war here in April, right? We're at war. There's William McKinley there on the right. He was assassinated. So on the other side of the world, the fighting begins. It actually happens in another island called the Philippines, right? The Philippines at this point was Spain's largest remaining colony. And this uprising is led. They have a young Filipino is leading the resistance to Spain, Emilio Aguinaldo. And we're going to talk about Emilio Aguinaldo when we get back from Thanksgiving break, and we talk about the Philippine insurrection. Don't you just love that title of a conflict? Love that. It wasn't pretty. Theodore Roosevelt. I'm wearing a shirt today. He was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy at this time, instructed the commander of the Pacific Squadron, Commander George Dewey, to prepare for hostilities 2 months before the declaration of war. And on May 1st, again, this is a couple days after we declare war, Dewey's squadron steams into Manila Bay and opened fire on the Spanish fleet. Almost the entire Spanish fleet was completely destroyed. Dewey didn't lose a single ship, and I don't even know if he even had a casualty. So this was a dominant performance of the U.S., and now we are controlling the Philippines, which is one of Spain's possessions, right? So, fighting in Cuba. So the Navy sets up blockade in Havana. U.S. Army in Cuba is made up of various forces, okay? There are 4 regiments of African-American soldiers. Buffalo Soldier in the heart of America, right? These are the Buffalo Soldiers. Many fought in the Indian Wars in the West. There were also these volunteer regiments, including one led by Theodore Roosevelt. There's a picture of them. They are called the Rough Riders, right? This is a group of college athletes and Western cowboys who formed the first U.S. volunteer cavalry, right? As if you don't know anything about Theodore Roosevelt, he is just a super rich kid who wants to bum it with everybody else, right? He's a football player. He's a cowboy. He took a bunch of these football players. Remember, football's kind of new. I know that Blake taught us when football began there in the 1870s. But these are just football players. They're like, oh man, let's go down there. Let's go kick some Spanish butt, right? So that's who the Rough Riders are, and that leads us to the most important, the Battle of San Juan Hill, right? So this is July 1st, 1898. Led by General William Schaefer, the army assaulted Santiago, moving against Spanish troops dug along the ridge. They take the ridge by nightfall, and the rest of the war goes really quickly. So this was the reason it's the climax is because this is the battle of the turning point of the war, right? This is where it's like, all right, it's over. Americans are going to win. So there it is, the Battle of San Juan Hill. There, I believe in this picture, there's old Theodore Roosevelt in his khaki color going in and trying to kill some Spanish folks, right?
Remember the man! They're almost at the top. Rising steadily like a tide. I could see men silhouetted against the sky. I could see the flags. I could see the flags, old man. I could see the flags! Waving like freedom!
So it wins. It's the first overseas victory. It's our first W. It's our first win. In the overseas game. In fact, it only took 10 weeks, so we're feeling pretty good about it. Hey, that was pretty easy. And then we sign. Well, we don't sign the Treaty of Paris. We come up with this peace agreement, the Treaty of Paris, December 10th, where Spain and U.S. signed this peace agreement. But it has to be ratified first. 3 main points, very important when we talk about our essential question, right? What factors led to the United States gaining colonies and increasing their influence overseas? Well, certainly the Treaty of Paris is one of those things, because it is what ends hostilities of the Spanish-American War. It gives Cuban independence. More on that later. It gives Puerto Rico and Guam to the U.S. and the Philippines. Guam, Puerto Rico, the Philippines. We actually pay for the Philippines, $20 million. So all of a sudden, here we are, this isolated, neutral country. After 10 weeks, we now own Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. We are a colonial power. Hello. So a lot of people didn't like this idea, right? There was this anti-imperialist league, and they felt like imperialism, I hope this works. Oh my God. Am I still recording? Yeah, still recording. Okay, so the Imperialist League, this is imperialism, violated the country's founding principles of freedom and democracy, right? Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, self-determination. People should rule themselves. Andrew Carnegie, Mark Twain, Jane Addams, there's some pictures of them. They're just a couple of people that were a part of this league. And they hold that this policy known as imperialism is hostile to liberty. We insist that the subjugation of any peoples is criminal aggression and open disloyalty to the distinctive principles of our government. So there were definitely Americans who are not for this, right? There were supporters of the treaty, though. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge is one of these people. Forming an empire, and Theodore Roosevelt was one of them too. Forming an empire was critical to our nation's future in order to compete with the other powers. And Henry Cabot Lodge did write to Roosevelt, rejection of this treaty would be a humiliation of the whole country in the eyes of the world and would show we are unfit to enter into a great question of foreign policy. Treaty passes 57-27. Now, we're an empire. It passes, right? So, last thing, Platt Amendment, right? We said in the Treaty of Paris that we are going to give independence to Cuba. Well, that did not happen. The U.S. controlled Cuba for 4 years under a military government, and they improved sanitation roads, but many Cubans began to resent U.S. control. It kind of violated the spirit of the Teller Amendment, which we talked about, and the Treaty of Paris, which we also talked about, and it created this thing called the Platt Amendment. This allowed the United States to intervene in Cuban affairs and buy or lease land for naval bases. So kind of goes against the spirit of the Teller Amendment, of the original ideas of what we were trying to do. And by 1913, American investment in the island quadruples to $220 million. And this is in 1913. U.S. business interests own over 60% of Cuba. This is the definition, ladies and gentlemen, of imperialism, influencing the economies and everybody else. Let's go back to the essential question. So obviously we can see now what factors led Americans to acquire colonies and spread American power overseas. Certainly, Spanish-American War is one of those things. And I think that we kind of know why we went to war against Spain in 1898 and why the outcome was significant. So what is your job? You need to tell the story to a family member over break. This is your mission over break. You're going to use your story map that you've been working on all week, whether it's digital or by hand, to use it as a guide to tell your story to the family member and record yourself doing it. What happens if you can't find a family member? Morning, Trev. Morning. How are you today? Hey, listen, I got this assignment to do for school. I've got to tell the story of the Spanish-American War.
Is that the one with Saddam Hussein?
Saddam Hussein? No, this is the one with Teddy Roosevelt.